It's time for Should Christians Watch? A nun, a professor, and a TV writer discuss television from a Christian perspective. Today's discussion: death and afterlife. And then 3 recommendations. So let's ask the question.
I do and say what the I want, and then when it all gets too much, I can always kill myself. It's like a superpower.
That's the worst superhero I've ever heard of.
Afterlife is a series on Netflix written, produced, and starring Ricky Gervais. He's done 2 seasons. The 2nd season just recently premiered. It's about a man who loses his wife to cancer. The first opening scene is he's watching a video that she made while she was dying of cancer, and he's just kind of in tears watching his wife. He decides to be a complete jerk. He decides not to be nice to people. He sort of decides it's a superpower. He doesn't really have anything to live for. And in fact, he contemplates suicide for most of the 1st season and a lot of the 2nd, but decides to stay alive mostly because he has a dog that he loves and he wants to care for. I just found from the beginning being invited into this guy's grief and pain was heart-wrenching. And these are not places that I live very often, in these depths of emotion. And that's what I found so valuable about it. And then, how am I going to treat people who are in such deep pain? How would I have a conversation with God about this character? And then the way he treats all these others, because, Ricky Gervais created the original version of The Office, and similar kinds of characters in the American version, kind of the least of these, kind of the losers, kind of the looked overs, the leftovers of society. And yeah, this character makes fun of them, but then he's nice to them. And I just wonder how I'm treating them, which is why this show kind of convicts me. I think this is one of the best written shows currently on TV. It's funny from start to finish. I've always found Ricky Gervais's material to be really funny. I think he's a really underrated writer. He's a really good performer. I find myself tearing up on this show during almost every episode, and I don't tear up at hardly anything. And I just find it to be a rich study of grief and also one of the funnier shows on TV right now.
I agree, Dean. It is very well written. However, Ricky Gervais is quite offensive throughout the whole thing.
I, too, really cringed a lot because I do think Gervais's humor, and there are some things, even my own sensibilities. I hear my mother's voice in the back of my ear saying, I would not be comfortable watching this with my mom.
We have to be a lot more specific here about the language. He uses a word that is maybe a little more common in Britain, that many might feel is one of the most offensive words in the English language, and he uses it liberally. But that's because of who he is in pain. And we talk about should Christians watch. Why Christians should watch a show like this is because we get to see somebody who doesn't have any understanding of the eternal figure out how to live and why to live. And what is intriguing to me and what chokes me up when I think about this show is that the way he gets meaning out of his life is by demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit. He starts caring about people and getting involved in their lives. The character who decides he's going to treat everybody horribly by the end of the 1st season is treating them nicely. By season 2, he's become Jesus to them. And I just really think it's a phenomenal way to tell a story about goodness.
Really, by the 2nd season, I was crying my eyes out, realizing that its take on grief and dealing with grief and the stages of grief is very profound. He begins to realize that he can overcome his grief when he gives of himself to others, when he starts recognizing the gift that other people are. And it especially comes out with the woman, Anne, that he sits with at the cemetery.
I'm Anne.
I'm Tony. Nice to meet you.
He seems nice.
Does he agree?
Of course. Never disagreed with me once, not in 48 years.
And she really brings that out for him. She says, even though I'm in pain, because she's suffering the loss of her husband, she goes, even though I'm in pain, it's worth sticking around to make a little corner of the world a slightly better place. Even if it doesn't mention anything about God or, afterlife, how do we find joy in the moment?
I think that deep down, that you still think life's worth living. It's nowhere near over for you. You're in pain. But the thing you lost is the same thing that can stop that pain.
I think maybe this show is really for non-believers. Ricky Gervais being one of them, because if they don't believe in God, at the very least, it gets them to believe in self-sacrificing love.
You know, my wife had cancer last year, so I went through some of these same emotions. And so maybe that was what was being drug up in me as well. But both Beth and I found this to be so rich and so kind of, I hate using words like pre-evangelistic. I just think it brings characters to a point that say, hey, maybe there is an eternal and maybe Jesus is the answer. And again, that's not Ricky Gervais's intent here. And he'd be angry that we're talking about it on this level. But that's what I see in this character is, where's this character heading? How could I reach out to him if I was meeting him or writing him? How would I try to continue and add to his life?
Why do you think he'd be upset with us for talking about it?
Because Gervais doesn't want anybody to think about God, doesn't want anybody to get closer to God. He's an evangelistic atheist. So I'm sort of joking that saying he'd be angry that we're talking about it. He likes people talking about his work because he's an artist. But I just think that he had no idea. I don't think he had any idea that a TV writer, a professor, and a nun would be sitting around talking about his work.
I mean, I agree that he would probably be surprised that we're paying attention, or maybe surprised that we enjoy it, maybe. But it does, kind of like what you're saying, Dean, it does seem to be an invitation to meditate on this from wherever you're coming from.
He'd say we're three stupid blanks, and that's the word he uses a lot on the show, and I won't say it.
You, Eleanor Shellstrom, are dead.
Or...
You're in the good place.
I'm not supposed to be here.
Wait, what?
Do you have a second to talk about the environment?
Do you have a second to eat my farts?
Oh, somebody royally forked up.
You can't curse here.
It's bullshit.
Oh!
The Good Place stars Kristen Bell as Eleanor. She's a selfish saleswoman who dies and enters the good place by mistake, and so has to then earn her spot by learning how to be a good person. This fantasy comedy that originally aired on NBC focuses on a person's ethical behavior as an experiment that looks at the possibility of good moral living leading to a happy afterlife. Now, this is an interesting and unique script by Michael Schur that tries to be removed of all religious views while seemingly including all faith perspectives.
So who is right?
Every religion guessed about 5%, except for Doug Forsett. One night he got high on mushrooms and got like 92% correct.
I don't know. You know, as Christians watching this is a problem with this. We're not redeemed of ourselves, by our own determination. I mean, faith is an element of good moral living that provides the why. And that's never dealt with in the show. It provides the why. Why do we even try to be good? Why do we even try to live happy lives? Why do we even try to live good lives? There's something more, and that something more never gets really answered in this show, and it leaves it open. That's good. Yes, it's for all different faith backgrounds, fine. But we know as Christians that it is love itself, where the reason, the why, is God. In my perspective, it's focusing on Jean-Paul Sartre's view of human self-determination. So, Cutter, you might want to go on that, a little bit on that part.
Yeah, I mean, what's fun about this show is it's actually getting at some pretty big philosophical questions, but in a way that is accessible. But at the end of the day, what's fun about it is that it really, to me, represents the way that most of us live day to day in terms of how we decide what is good or not. And for that, it really actually challenges us to think a little bit more deeply about the ways that we decide whether or not something is moral or not, whether something is virtuous or not, especially in the way that we relate to other people in our life.
I don't really care about questions of if it's moral or not. I care if a show is funny when I start watching it. And it's sometimes a struggle for me as a comedy writer to find shows that I think are funny. And I never connected with this show because I found it amusing rather than being funny. But I'm also jealous of Mike Schur of getting this show on the air because it's the kind of show I wish I had created because I would have loved to have dealt with the issues that he was dealing with. I do think there'll be books written about this show. I think there'll be classes about it at seminaries and colleges. But I just never connected with it, maybe partly because I wanted more actual religion. Sister Nancy's right. It's kind of all religions and no religions at all. And then she mentioned some guy I'd never heard of. But it just kind of goes into this. I wanted it to be deeper. I wanted it to be, I wanted to know a little. I wanted the writer to have more of a point of view, actually, even if I didn't agree with it.
I'm trying to say this without spoiling anything for people that are maybe new to the show. But it does have a few twists that hinge upon sort of cliffhangers at the end of season 1.
Yes.
And in the final, the finale is interesting as well. This sort of generic afterlife that's dependent upon sort of this moral equation of goodness and badness.
Why don't you just tell me the right answer?
Well, that's what's so great about the trolley problem is that there is no right answer.
This is why everyone hates moral philosophy professors.
I'm on your side here, dude, but he is not wrong.
It's not that we're all sort of the metaphor of the blind men grappling with an elephant, and one feels a trunk and a leg or whatever. We actually are all pursuing different ends and in distinct ways, and answering different questions with different problems depending upon your religious tradition. And so the interesting thing, one way to read the show, is that even though the setup is exactly what you're describing, these couple of turns that are in there might actually turn around and challenge that very notion at its core. Now, whether or not any of that's funny, well, that's where Dean comes in and tells us, no, it is not funny. I'm an actual professional of funniness.
If you think it's funny, that's all that matters. You're wrong, but that's all that matters. If you're laughing, that's fine. It's an involuntary reaction, but that's fine.
I agree, Dean, that it's not very funny, and I didn't find it very funny. Actually, I find it kind of annoying in some ways, but what I did find interesting about it is that it does show that human beings are redeemable, that they're not, even if they're bad or whatever, they can become good. They can choose good. And so I that's the element I really got out of the whole season, all the seasons.
My recommendation is an Amazon original called Homecoming. It is actually written and created by Sam Ismail, who, if some of you have watched Mr. Robot, might know of his work. Homecoming stars Julia Roberts, and she works for an organization that helps transition soldiers back into civilian life. It's really a fascinating take, in part because it's a sort of brooding mystery that you don't really know where it's going. But it's also a really interesting reflection on what it means for soldiers coming back with PTSD to reintegrate into society. The various things that we need to do, want to do, how we might do it and be a part of that. But then also it raises a number of different questions about the way that other industries, for-profit industries, might be leveraging this group of people for their own gain. And so I really recommend Homecoming. It is rated MA for violence and some language, but it is actually something that I think any adult Christian who's interested in the effects of violence and war and post-traumatic stress disorder would really find Homecoming a great show to watch.
I want to recommend a miniseries called From the Earth to the Moon. It was on HBO in 1998, so it can be found on HBO On Demand, HBO Go. It was actually the miniseries that started them doing all these kind of prime miniseries like Band of Brothers and John Adams on through to today. It's about the space program, 1960 to 1972, the Apollo missions, 12 episodes. Really rich character development, predates Apollo 13, really gets into the struggles, the relationships, the wives, all the things that were going on during the space program. I also want to pinpoint two things that happened. When the first astronauts went on the trip that first orbited the moon, as they orbited the moon, they read from Genesis, which was broadcast back to America live. And then when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong first landed on the moon, the first thing that Buzz Aldrin did was have communion, which he had brought with him from Earth. So his first act on the moon was to take communion. So I just want to mention that those characters of faith, those representations of faith, are really well represented in the show. But it's just a fantastic, underrated, kind of overlooked miniseries, From the Earth to the Moon. Tom Hanks produced it. It's on HBO.
I recommend All American. It's a CW series now streaming on Netflix. It's a teen drama that's loosely based on the true story of ex-NFL player Spencer Paysinger, who's from South Central LA and who's recruited to play football for Beverly Hills High School. It's a show for teens and parents to watch together because it deals with a lot of deep and profound issues like related to family life or gang violence, also authentic friendship and self-sacrificing love. It also shows some questionable ethical behaviors, but always presenting the consequences to one's actions. So I think it's a really good show for discussion. And one thing about it is it shows teens needing their parents' acceptance, love, and security. So I recommend watching this show, All American. Until next time, I'm the nun, Sister Nancy Usselman.
I'm the professor, Dr. Cutter Calloway.
And I'm the TV writer, Mission Control Director Dean Vitale.